My Lords, this has been a very well-informed debate, one might even say learned, and I'm hoping that I don't bring the tone down too far. It's obviously a huge topic, and I'm going to pick a few issues where I feel the government has got it extremely badly wrong. I would have added digital issues as well if I knew more about them, but as it is, I have four. The first is prevent. Now, no one would disagree that prevention is better than cure, but at the same time, you have to make sure that what you put in place actually functions. And my argument is that prevent doesn't. It has far too many failings. It's targeted too many innocent people, including children. And at this stage, it doesn't have the respect to communities that it's meant to be engaging with. It I think, has actually become counterproductive. Part of the problem is that it's vague and prone to misapplication, particularly because its definition of extremism is so broad. And in fact, Lord MacDonald QC, a former Director of Public Prosecutions, has described the definition as hopeless. So despite a declared intention to introduce a counter-extremism bill, there is not yet a statutory definition of extremism. The only working definition of extremism is the Prevent one, which is vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values. That is just too broad. It encompasses far too many people. Now, Liberty, the NGO, has done a very good briefing on Prevent, which I can pass on to you, and their three recommendations are: repeal the statutory duty. It has absolutely failed and brought Prevent into disrepute. Drop the focus on non-violent extremism, and establish an independent review of Prevent. We've had something close to this from the Prime Minister, but we really do need to move on with it. And we need a community-led, collaborative effort, approach to tackling extremism. The vast majority of people want to help. They want to defeat terrorism, and we tend to ignore them. We need what Lord Harris of Haringey called a culture of resistance. That's exactly what we need, and we need to engage with people and get them to trust us. My second issue is the government's declared intention of establishing a commission for countering extremism. Now, we still don't know much about this commission, but we understand it will be statutory and called the Commission for Countering Extremism. Apparently, it will identify examples of extremism and expose them. It also includes proposals to regulate online spaces with a digital charter. Now, my argument is that we already have laws that fulfil these needs. We actually don't need any more. We need to use the laws we have and resource them properly. That's part of the problem. The agencies responsible just don't have the resources to do the job. In fact, the independent reviewer of terrorism, Max Hill, QC, has said we don't need new laws to tackle the current terrorist threat. But despite this, the government's still going to try to legislate, and not even just for terrorism, but what it calls non-violent extremism. Now, is this ideas that are difficult or unpleasant or offensive? What does that mean? Or is it just ideas that the government perhaps disagrees with? The simple fact is it's impossible to agree a definition of what constitutes an extremist. We all have very different ideas. Personally, I argue that the DUP is an extremist organisation. And personally, I think it's quite dangerous to set up a commission that is responsible for defining and identifying and exposing people that it thinks extreme. As I've said before in your Lordship's House, I have concerns that we will create our own distinctively British brand of McCarthyism. And I have concerns about press freedom as well. That's surely a fundamental British value, that our press is free and reports on all our strange ways, whether we're politicians or members of the public. I also have concerns that people will be seen as criminals through thought crime. They won't actually commit a crime, they will just be thinking about it. That actually doesn't make them a criminal. I'm also curious about, will we have our own equivalent of the European Court of Justice? I think today there was something about having an interim relationship with it. I would like to know more about that if it's possible. And where will people take their cases when they feel that the government's been intrusive or or that they've been over-policed. And the DUP, of course, where do they sit in deciding all these things? How much of a voice do they have? I really would like some answers on this. I mean, at the moment, there are more questions than answers, obviously, so anything that we can hear would be great. My third issue is policing, and in the more than decade and a half that I was a severe critic of the Met Police, on their police authority and then on the policing committee that we had, I didn't think that I'd be defending them quite so fiercely as I would like to today. It's experienced massive budget cuts. They were far too fast, far too hard. It meant that no rational decisions could be made. They just had to cut so many millions every year. And personally, I think that it's created a Met Police force that perhaps isn't quite fit for purpose anymore. And although, of course, you might argue that the budget isn't changing, if the budget is static, that means costs are rising, and actually they are much worse off. Now, the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime said recently that the Met already have a budget shortfall of £170 million for national counter-terrorism work. That is work over and above their responsibility as a police force for the capital. It's money normally expected from the government. So is the government please going to pay that back to the Met? I'd like to know that. I mean, personally, I think, of course, the government should be paying this, but somehow the magic money tree can't be found when it's a question of Londoners' safety. Now, that I find quite offensive. And if we are to forge better relations with communities so that we can have vital intelligence of all kinds of crime, including terrorism, then many more community officers, police officers, are needed. That means really understanding how we can prevent attacks on our freedoms. It's what Noble Lord Buck was calling neighbourhood policing. There just isn't enough of it anymore, and it means communities don't have an easy way of expressing their fears and concerns if they think they're perhaps a little bit too mild to report officially. Now, my last issue is Saudi Arabia. And as a politician, I understand that we sometimes have to work with some very unpleasant people. We have to sit down with them, we have to negotiate with them. We might loathe them, but we have to keep a dialogue going. However, we don't have to sell them arms. Saudi Arabia is a brutal dictatorship. It is one of the world's worst governments when you look at human rights abuses. We should not be selling them arms. Today, the High Court ruled that the case brought by Campaign Against the Arms Trade was not valid, that the government it was perfectly legal to sell Saudi Arabia arms. Now, I would argue if it's legal, then the law needs changing. And we also all know that legal doesn't mean ethical. Tax avoidance springs to mind, for example. The Labour leader said if Theresa May is serious about cutting off financial and ideological support for terrorism, she should publish the suppressed report on foreign funding of UK-based extremism and have difficult conversations with Saudi Arabia, not hug Saudi and allied Gulf states even closer. I think personally it's very embarrassing that we are selling arms to a country that is responsible for human rights abuses in its neighbouring Yemen. It is actually bombing hospitals, it's bombing schools, it's bombing weddings. How do we fit that with our conscience, that our arms are being used in that way? So I would like to know a little bit more about publishing that report. We heard a little bit earlier, but I'd like to know more about publishing it. And is it true that the foreign funding of extremist groups here, of terrorists, actually is that the Saudi royal family is involved in some way, because that's what people appear to be saying. So that will be good to know. If it does involve Saudi financing of groups here in the UK, that is absolutely unforgivable, and the government really does need to do something about it. Finally, I'd like to ask the Minister if she truly believes that we need more laws to fight terrorism, or if she does accept that we have enough laws, we just have to apply them properly. We already have a lot of intrusion into our private lives, and we have a significant amount of repression for people who think a bit differently. And I find that unacceptable. Theresa May herself has said something about celebrating the diversity of Britain. Well, everything the government is doing seems to be closing down that option. And finally, to echo Lord Harris and also the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Chelmsford, how far are we prepared to go in reducing our own freedoms as a response to people who are trying to take those freedoms away? It seems the exact opposite of what we should be doing. We should be celebrating our freedom and allowing more freedom than closing it down. Thank you.